Yeah, hi, good evening.
Good evening, sir. I want to have you here.
Hi, how are you doing? So you just want me to talk for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or do you want to just make it interactive? What would you prefer?
So the way we thought about it, if you could speak for about let's say half an hour, and then we could take a few questions at the end of it. That would be wonderful.
Okay, sounds good. Shall we start?
Yeah, we are good to start. Namaste everyone. I'm Shobit Mathur. I'm the Dean of the Rashtram School of Public Leadership and also the Pro Vice Chancellor at the Rishihood University. Today we have a very special lecture on the National Youth Day and a very special guest who can speak on youth, the unorganized sector, and different issues related to the so-called demographic dividend that we have. Also Swami Vivekananda's Jayanti, so it's a very important day. Shri Manish Sabharwal, all of you are fairly familiar about him. I mean, he's a very popular person, a public intellectual. He's a co-founder and vice chairman at the Teamlease services. And he's also a member of the National Skill Mission, Central Advisory Board for Education. He served on various policy committees on education, employment, employability, been an independent director with the RBI, and currently serves as the advisor to the Office of the CAG and the National Council of Applied Economic Research. He's interestingly working on setting up the first ever vocational university in India. I had come across Manish ji on YouTube. Initially, I had a lot of contrary views to Manish ji, particularly on the unorganized sector. That is my confession. But his arguments have always been very persuasive and have always challenged the assumptions that I've had. And I have changed many of my views after listening to him. I'm very confident that this session will also give you a lot of food for thought. And without taking further time, I would request Manish ji to dive in and take the session forward. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shobit. It's a pleasure to be here. Policy is a big word, and many people like democracy without politics, right? As if one is possible without the other. And I think the nature of the public policy debate in India has been stunted because of the lack of public policy schools, right? Because you don't have lateral entry in government, and the only way to enter government is by taking an exam when you're 18 years old. And I think that represents an incomplete view of policy. It represents an incomplete view of what government in a democracy should be. But I'll come back to that as the unfinished agenda of sort of how to solve the problem. I prefer to focus on, but I'll spend some time framing the problem. And obviously I will frame, where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit. And, where I sit is we have hired somebody every 5 minutes for 20 years, but we have only hired 5% of the kids who came to us for a job. So you can do the math. On any day, we have 3.5 lakh employees. So we are at the agony and ecstasy of India's labor market, right? The agony is, I had a job fair in Jaipur many years ago. I met 800 of the 35,000 kids who showed up, and I met, 200 of them myself. And I can guarantee if they were born in Delhi, Bombay, or Bangalore, they would have had a job. But they were born in Dausa, Barmer, Jhunjhunu, or Ajmer. So that's when I realized that the two most important decisions a child in India makes are to choose your parents and your PIN code wisely. And obviously anybody attending this seminar chose their parents and their PIN code wisely. I obviously did. But when we started Teamlease, I also realized that India was changing, right? I had a telecom client shouting at me, I need 200 salespeople. I told him, we're doing it for your competitors. So he called me back and said, I need a pair of hands. I don't care if a brain comes attached. So we are a child of lower hiring standards. Kids getting jobs with us today would not have got a job 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so these two sort of contrary themes have really confused me at one level and also clarified things for me at one level. That, there are a lot of people or a lot of kids in India who don't have jobs. Of the kind that they want, but they have jobs. And this is why I will frame my debate a little carefully for all of you. And I'd be happy to hear your thoughts that India doesn't have a jobs problem. We have a wages problem. India's unemployment rate has been between 4 and 9% since independence. But our poverty rates have obviously been somewhere between 25 and 35 or 40%, depending on how you define poverty. And that's not a contradiction in terms, because the poor cannot afford to be unemployed. So they are either self-employed or they work in agriculture. The two shock absorbers of India's labor markets have been agricultural employment and self-employment. And I'll come back to self-employment because most self-employment in India is not self-employment, it's self-exploitation at a certain level. But let me step back a little bit and say why I frame this wages problem as different from the employment problem. And, modern India is a child of two reckless experiments in 1947. There was a political experiment and there was an economic experiment. The political experiment has worked out wonderfully. We have created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. India and Pakistan, born on the same night, have had very different destinies because of obviously the 299 remarkable people who wrote our constitution between 47 and 50, but also because 3 million people in India win an election. 22 million people in India stand for some kind of election. So I think that most people would not have given India the odds, given we were large, given we were diverse. And we were the first country to give universal franchise at birth in that sense, right? Some women in Switzerland got to vote in 1972. So it's important to recognize that the odds on politics was quite low, which we've done well. The odds on economics was crazy, right? I mean, the 1955 Avadi resolution, which really got crystallized in the 1956 second five-year plan, basically ensured that capital is handicapped without labor and labor is handicapped without capital in modern India. So we have 63 million enterprises. They have a lot of labor, but very little capital. But we only have 23,500 companies in India with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. These companies have a lot of capital, but very little labor. The question really you have to ask yourself is, why did this happen? Was it sort of destined that policy should end up handicapping capital, handicapping labor, handicapping capital markets? And in what ways did this manifest itself, right? I think the most interesting question, which I hope all of you also ask yourself, can I move you back to this? Because then I can see some faces I don't want to see myself, so it's just sort of useless. So I think that the most interesting question of all times is why our country is poor, right? I landed in the US in August 94, and by September, I was asking myself, these Americans aren't smarter than us, why are they richer than us? And I hope you will ask this question in various ways, right? Because I don't think Americans are. There's no cultural explanations for India's poverty. Are at best the soft bigotry of low expectations, and at worst they are racism. India is not poor because of cultural reasons. It's poor because of a plumbing problem, and I will come back to that plumbing problem as we go ahead. But obviously, policy has a really big impact on where jobs get created, what kind of jobs get created, just overall development. And I think jobs is a very important manifestation of development. I don't think it's the only manifestation of development, but I think jobs may end up being the meta intervention. A job changes a life in a way that no subsidy ever can. Teaching a person how to fish rather than giving them fish. And so I have seen policy really in 5 ways, right? I am the child of a civil servant, which I now realize was a sampling error when you see the government as a child of a civil servant. I was executive assistant to the chairman of a large Indian group pre-reform, and I spent 15 days out of my month in Delhi, Shastri Bhavan, Yojana Bhavan, DGTD, CFE, the whole alphabet soup which kept India poor, right? That regulatory cholesterol which we has not, inhabited India, I mean, between 47 and say 1991. And, you really, if you ran a company pre-1991, you didn't have marketing, you had distribution. You didn't have treasury, you had accounting. You didn't have HR, you had admin. I mean, you didn't have clients, you had hostages, right? So it's important to recognize that, all the companies which were successful pre-1991 are not as successful now because animals bred in captivity find it hard to live in the jungle, right? And 80% of the market cap in 1991 is now down to 20%. But when I started my first company, I went to business school after working for 5 years after my BCom. I went to Sri Ram College, Delhi. And I started a company called India Life. I had 250 inspections in my first year. And then I sold India Life. And then obviously in Teamlease, in the first 5 years, we had more than 700 inspections every year. And now I see it from my policy roles, whether it was the RPI board or the CHG board or the Central Advisory Board on Education. And I think there's nothing as frustrating as government to work in or with. But there's nothing as powerful as government. I think you must not oversell the 3 pillars of any society. You know, today in India, the government has an execution deficit, but the private sector has a trust deficit, and nonprofits have a scale deficit. And I don't think anyone can claim or should claim that you can solve this problem alone, particularly the jobs problem, which I'll come back to. But so if we accept that the problem is of balance, right? It's not clear to me that the government could ever run an airline better than JRD Tata. I don't think anybody could ever run an airline or a hotel as nicely as the Oberoi's. And at one point, the government was baking bread in Delhi also, right? So I think that was clearly not swimming in your lane or not being honest about what you're good at. But I don't think the private sector could do primary education or do primary healthcare or could, manage Kumbh Mela for that matter. I think there are clear things that the government can do, and I don't think the private sector should claim that it can do it. But over the last 2 years, COVID, a lot of people have been shocked at how the labor market has behaved during COVID when they see pictures of migrants. But, COVID has not created anything new. It is just an X-ray. It has revealed pre-existing conditions or comorbidities in that sense, right? And obviously, there are some difficult binaries, us versus them, lives versus livelihood, jobs versus jobs. And people want to ask, saying that, what do you want to do? How do we solve this problem? And policy can only do three things, at least in economics, right? It can do fiscal reform, it can do monetary reform, and it can do structural reform. Now, fiscal reform is fiscal interventions, let's not call it reform. They're interesting, right? Because the fiscal deficit of the US this year is more than our GDP. So it's important to recognize why, first of all. I mean, obviously, India must raise its tax to GDP ratio, but we entered COVID with a 70% tax to GDP ratio. We'll exit COVID with something above 90%. So I think, and also we must recognize that if fiscal deficits made countries rich, then no country would be poor, right? Why would, if fiscal deficit, if you could just spend your way to being rich, then why would you be poor? So I think there are limits to fiscal policy. I think monetary intervention, monetary policy, I still haven't made up my mind on whether monetary policy is a placebo, it's a steroid, or whether it's just a painkiller. But surely monetary policy cannot solve labor market problems or structural problems. And I think the lower for longer, the expansion of central bank balance sheets, central banks have lending powers, they don't have spending powers. And I think the way central banks have behaved in the last 2, 3, 5 years is really going to come back and create challenges for them, at least globally. So I would submit that structural reform, which is really what the 5 transitions of India, farm to non-farm, rural to urban, subsistence self-employment to wage employment, school to work, and sort of non-farm to farm to non-farm, is really always been the perpetual challenge, right? I mean, that this is the perennial pandemic in India, if you would like to think about it, of productivity. Finally, poverty is about productivity. And the informal sector is a very hard thing to define. And I think you will have to make up your mind on whether 63 million enterprises in India, of which 12 million don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 12 million are registered for GST, only 1 million pay PF and ESI, and only 23,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. So that enterprise stack which we have, is it necessary? The US economy is 8 times our size and it only has 24 million enterprises, right? And I would submit India has a unique opportunity right now. There are really 3 opportunities right now. Let's call them a policy window. John Kingdon says that when the problem, the solution, and the opportunity come together is when reform happens. So I'd say that there is a sort of clearly a structural window. There's a new world of work. My parents worked for 35 years. I'll work for 45 years. My kids will work for 55 years. Employment has shifted from a lifetime contract to a taxi cab relationship. There's a new world of organizations. The average life expectancy of a Fortune 500 company has come down from 65 years to 15. There's a new world of education. In a world where Google knows everything, knowing is useless, right? And you have to figure out how to pay for education without doing what the US has done. They have a $1.5 trillion of student debt, of which half will have to be written off. But I think the more important window is the geopolitical window, the global shift of economic gravity to Asia, out of the 192 members of the UN, 52 countries now have a declining working age population. And you need to be clear of the implications of that. You know, Japan's working age population has been declining since 1998. Its population now comes down 1,500 people per day. I think there's a capital glut all over the world, which is linked to this demography, which we don't understand, right? I mean, 40% of the world's bonds trade at less than 1% interest rates. 20% of the world's bonds trade at negative interest rates. So when fixed income becomes no income, you will overvalue growth. And India is one of the few countries in the world with more than 200 million people with 20 years of growth ahead of us. I think the China fatigue, you know, it looks like Xi Jinping has made a list of everything Deng Xiaoping did right and is now striking it off. That's good for India in some sense. You know, China's genius. I mean, we have to be jealous of the 700 million people that they have moved from farm to non-farm employment. Obviously, India cannot and will not grow up to be China. We don't want to. But I do think that Deng Xiaoping, if there was one person who reduced poverty at a scale of human history of 700 million people within a certain time frame, it would be Deng Xiaoping. But China obviously has decided, I think prematurely, that they have arrived and that they don't need the world and that they don't need their private sector in the way that they needed it for the last 30 years. So we will see. I mean, nobody ever won in the last 40 years by betting against China. But I do think that the China fatigue all over the world in boardrooms and investors, foreign investors have now lost $1.5 trillion in the last 1 year in China. So for the first time since 1978, they have actually lost money. So we'll see what the implications of that are. But obviously the digitization super cycle is really good for India. You know, work from home for somebody in New York can work from Chicago means work from anywhere. You could work from India. And so there's no company which is a tech company because every company is a tech company. And this has important implications for India. But I think the most important one is really the reform window that this opens up for us. And I think that when we talk of the informal sector, the informality is how land, labor, and capital combine. The informality is not the informal land or the informal capital. And I think we have never had a shortage of land, labor, capital in India, right? You could give every Indian household half an acre and they would fit into Rajasthan and half of Maharashtra. We've never had a shortage of labor. 40% of our labor force is Vela anyway, right? We don't seem to have a shortage of capital for the right ideas. We have $60 billion of private equity created a unicorn every 10 days last year. I mean, this is the same India attracting this capital. So I think the fourth factor of production, which most economists find it hard to measure and therefore they don't talk as much about, is entrepreneurship, is innovation, is technology. Economists tend to call it total factor productivity or TFP. And I think TFP is really at the crux of India's problems. And why is TFP such a problem? It is the productivity of our regions, it is the productivity of our companies, and it is the productivity of our individuals. You know, I live in Karnataka, my people live in UP. Both the states have the same GDP, but Karnataka does it with 1/4 the number of people, right? And I think a point that I would make again and again is there are no such thing as poor people. There are people in poor places. You know, you move an electrician from Patna to Bangalore, he gets 4 times more salary. You move a plumber from Nigeria to the US, he gets 25 times more salary. So the pathology doesn't lie at the level of the individual. The pathology is in the productivity of the place. And so the productivity of our regions is really important. Obviously, the productivity of our companies, the firms that we have. We just finished an exercise where we ranked manufacturing companies by size and the 90th percentile in 10th. The biggest and smallest companies have a 24 times difference in productivity. Now, if you're not productive, you'll never pay the wage premium. But if you don't pay the wage premium, you'll never be productive. And I think that is the curse of informality or this low-level equilibrium that we got stuck in for many years, where unemployment rates were very low, but poverty was very high. So employed poverty, which is really the disease of India from 1947 till maybe even recently, and it still is in some pockets. So that bhuka nanga pyasa problem, because if you think India has a jobs problem, then you'll throw money from helicopters, you'll mandate a 3-day work week, you'll take away people's shovels and give them spoons because productivity doesn't matter. But if you now recognize that the productivity of individuals, companies, and regions is linked, then you will recognize that we are entering what Eliud Kipchoge, Kipchoge is a Kenyan marathoner. I don't know how many of you have heard of him, but he's the only person in the world to have run a marathon in less than 2 hours. And when he won the gold medal right now after the London Olympics, he said, you run the first half of the marathon on your legs and the second half on your mind. And I think that's really profound understanding of performance, even at company levels and country levels and individual levels, right? The middle income trap is essentially what Kipchoge is talking about, right? After a point, you can't throw more land, labor, and capital. You need to figure out how the land, labor, capital combine, which is total factor productivity. In companies, why do most companies peak off at 50 crores or 100 crores, whatever the median is? Because you don't shift from what brings you to 10, 20 crores will not take you to 5,000 crores. I mean, I'm speaking from experience. My first company was a 75 crore company. Teamlease this year is 5,000 crores. So as an entrepreneur, there are two kinds of companies you can create, a baby and a dwarf. A baby and a dwarf are both small, but the baby is going to grow and the dwarf is going to stay there. So I think that if you are in the dwarf syndrome, if you believe that India's problem is jobs, then obviously you'll throw money from helicopters. But if you recognize now that the second half of the marathon is not run on your legs, it's run on your mind. If you think the second half of the marathon is not about land, labor, capital, it's about total factor productivity, then you will focus on formalization, urbanization, industrialization, financialization, and human capital. And I would say that is really the JJ car of 1991 is important. And 1991 was an important discontinuity in India's economy. But China and India had the same GDP in 1991. India's reforms in 1991 left out education, they left out corruption, they left out formalization. At one level, they even left out financialization. Credit to GDP ratio in India has been stuck at 50%. And I don't think China's 300% credit to GDP is the right number, but obviously 50% is absolutely the wrong number. So if you think about my case for the costs of informality, the cost of informality is not jobs. India doesn't have a jobs problem. The cost of informality is productivity. The cost of informality is really world-beating companies. Do you need 63 million enterprises? You may say, well, I need them because I can't provide the alternative. But that's a chicken and egg problem, right? I mean, the only way to solve the chicken and egg problem is to become vegetarian, right? Do something different. And if you keep stuck in that low-level equilibrium that, look, India doesn't know how to create formal jobs. We need the informal sector as a shock absorber, then you'll never get out of that low-level equilibrium is what my case to you would be. I'm happy to counter on saying that what are the costs of this transition? How does this transition get going? But I think we've done a lot, right? I think GST is a very important part of that. I think labor laws are a very important part of that. I think Air India's privatization, the PLI scheme, NPCI, I mean, they're all related, right? I mean, we have to shift our thinking from classical physics, which is discrete systems in government, to quantum physics, where everything is sort of interrelated. And financialization spurs on formalization, formalization spurs on industrialization, industrialization then spurs on urbanization. And so I think it's very hard for you to sort of, the inch-wide, mile-deep thinking, which somehow, is a disease which infects bureaucrats. I mean, I don't think we should have a mile-wide, inch-deep thinking either. But I do think that unless you think of the unorganized and informal sector, not as a specific, it's a symptom of underlying regulatory cholesterol. It's a symptom of underlying lack of decentralization. India, 29 chief ministers matter one more than one prime minister. 100 mayors matter more than 29 chief ministers, because all job markets are local, right? And if you think of India, the central government budget is 34 lakh crores. If you total up the budget of all state governments, it's about 45 lakh crores. But 2.5 lakh state municipalities and panchayats have a total budget of 3.7 lakh crores. That makes no sense, right? 3.7 lakh crores for 2.5 lakh municipalities and panchayats, and to 34 lakh crores at the center. So I think that decentralization, and in 1924, Jawaharlal Nehru was the mayor of Allahabad, Vallabhbhai Patel was the mayor of Ahmedabad, Chittaranjan Das was the mayor of Calcutta, and Rajendra Prasad mayor of Patna. And I have 4 letters of Vallabhbhai Patel talking about school teacher absenteeism, 2 letters of Jawaharlal Nehru talking about streetlights. So I think it's important to recognize decentralization is an unfinished agenda which will tackle this. I think education and skills is also an unfinished agenda. NEP is a very important document. I think it's the new education policy recognizes that massification of higher education requires vocationalization of higher education, but you can't unpack education and employability the way you did. In 1934, Mahatma Gandhi gave a wonderful speech at Wardha about Nai Talim, which was really about experiential education. But the 1948 Radhakrishnan report, the 1968 Kothari Committee report, nor did the 1986 new National Education Policy capture this sort of massification objective linked to primary education. I think from a strategic perspective, the Indian state will have to do less so it can do more. I don't think we need 55 ministries in Delhi. Japan has 8 cabinet ministers, the US 14, UK has 24. I think ease of doing business, we will have to think about how many ministries we need in Delhi. I definitely don't think we need 250 people in Delhi with the rank of Secretary to Government of India. It makes no sense to be so top heavy. So I think civil service reform, the steel frame of India at 0 has become the steel cage of India at 975. And if we want to get to India at 100, then we really have to think about civil service reform. You treat civil service treats Gadha Goda equally. When you treat Gadha Goda equally, it is the Gadha who celebrates and the Ghoda who gets frustrated. So you've got to be very clear about 99% of most civil services are cadres are ranked outstanding. That's not mathematically possible. And obviously, this civil service reform is linked to the broader ease of doing business. I would make the case, because we have 67,000 compliances, 6,700 filings for employers. That makes no sense. That is not leading to higher compliance. In fact, we have 26,410 ways to go to jail embedded in the 67,000 compliances for an employer. So we put out these details last year because we did a 2-year project, because I was quite disillusioned with the World Bank ease of doing business framework because it was not incorporating the perspective of employers. So in conclusion, I think, when I landed in the US in 1994, there was a front page article on the Wall Street Journal which said that India is more interesting than important. I hope the journalist is eating the newspaper on which he wrote that, right? Because what's happening in India is not once in a decade or once in a millennium. It's really once in the lifetime of a country. And we have built the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. But why didn't we build the world's largest economy? It was not God's will that it should take 72 years for 1.3 billion Indians to cross the GDP of 66 million Britishers. I think it was not about skills. It was not about abilities. It was, Dumbledore tells Harry Potter, it is our choices more than our abilities that reveal what we really are in Chamber of Secrets. And I think we made some really crappy economic choices post-independence. And I think we need a more adventurous state. We need to keep reminding ourselves that we're 138th in the world in per capita GDP. We may be 5th in the world, and we'll soon be 3rd in the world. I think Japan and Germany are the 2 countries ahead of us in total GDP. We will cross that. I do think there are emergent properties of size. I have been noticing in the last 1 year, as the world concludes, we will be the world's 3rd largest economy. In investment committees of investors and boardrooms of multinationals, they feel that once you get to 4 trillion, 5 trillion, you can no longer ignore India. But so that'll happen anyway, right? This will be the first year that India will export more oil than more software than Saudi Arabia will oil. I think you must process and think about that, right? Because digging oil out of the ground is not very complex. It has been rewarding for the Middle East, but exporting $180 billion of software is a really complex endeavor of human capital, of communication, of project management, of trust, of skilling, of many things. And this 5 million people, do it. So 0.8% of our labor force in IT produces 8% of GDP. Now, this 5 million is going to 10 million for sure in the next 10 years. We're quite clear about that. So I think that oasis of high productivity, which we see in IT, I live in Bangalore, so I'm obviously quite familiar, is really something we can replicate. For India at 100, if we just set our targets to what makes a strong country, it's really economic complexity. India is very economically complex. We make everything and do everything. We don't always do it well. We don't always do it at scale. But I think India won't grow up to be China. 55% of our GDP won't be exports. I don't think that's the way our economic trajectory will work. That doesn't mean we have to shut ourselves off for the world, but manufacturing has changed. Everything has changed. So I think, if we focus on sort of formalization, urbanization, industrialization, financialization, and human capital, that is what will raise the per capita GDP of our country. And, one of my favorite poets is sort of Ramdhari Singh Dinkar. And he always says, Shama Shobhati us bhujang ko jiske paas garal ho. Only snakes with venom can be kind, benevolent, and generous, right? If you don't have venom, then what is the question of being generous or kind? The powerful only can be. And I think that the world is, sometimes when you get to my age, you wonder what matters more, luck or skill in building a company and being rich. And obviously luck matters a lot. And I think there's an interesting turn geopolitically. There's an interesting turn in the world of work. There's an interesting turn in the world of education. And there's just an interesting turn in India's own capabilities. No economic models of the World Bank or IMF would predict a country with the $2,500 per capita income exporting $180 billion of software. That just would not happen, right? They would advise us to focus on garments. They would advise us to be jealous of Bangladesh. They would advise us to talk about Finland, but nobody would predict that 5 million Indians would be exporting $180 billion of software. Now, we can go into why that happened, but we can also learn from that example. And I think that is starting to have a lot of externalities. Almost all the unicorns created last year either have a board member or an investor or a mentor who is an alumni of India's software industry, because many of these companies are solving very real problems of the Indian economy. They're using global capital to solve it. So I'm quite sort of hopeful that when you think about the next 25 years, India at 100, they will be really different from the last 25 years. Obviously, we haven't finished the agenda, but the unorganized sector is just transmission losses between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced. I think we need to move from deals to rules. I think deals is a very inefficient way to organize your economy. And we need to move from deals to rules. Now, if our rules or the regulatory cholesterol is, like the chief labor commissioner once told me, I'm trying to enforce the unenforceable. Well, if you're trying to enforce the unenforceable, then stop. Don't enforce the unenforceable. And let's have a debate on what 5 things in labor laws, whether it is minimum wages, whether it is social security, whether it is leave, what should be non-negotiable. But you can't have 17 definitions of wages. You can't have 21 definitions of workers, because all this just breeds corruption. And there's nothing cultural about corruption. So I will pause here. I have, it's sort of clear to me that, COVID has been tough for some parts of the economy. But COVID has also created an urgency for change. Sometimes India doesn't change for a better option. She changes when you have no option. I'm not sure why we have to do that. Maybe that's the nature of democracy, not the nature of India. I think so. But I think there is, COVID has been an X-ray. It has exposed our pre-existing fractures, pre-existing comorbidities. And I think now that we have brought them to surface, democracies are good at solving these problems once you surface them. Obviously, there is a questioning of the role of the private sector. Should the government is a good government a small government? I don't think so. All I have been asking for 20 years is, can we restore the balance between what the government should do, what the private sector to do, and what civil society should do? And I think we're getting better at that balance. So I'm quite hopeful about how the future will carry us. So let me pause here. I can dive into more details, or if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Manish ji. In your very typical style, you have put in a lot of issues and particularly opened up many different ways we can think of addressing these issues. So once you have questions, you can possibly raise your hand and I can ask you to unmute and speak up. Okay, questions time. Okay, Dhawan, please.
Namaste, sir. I'm Dhawan. I'm a learner at Rashtram School of Public Leadership. Whenever we speak of empowering the unorganized sector, it is always about giving capital to the unorganized sector. It is more majorly about, the government has paid these many thousands of crores for the unorganized sector. So is it a right way to treat the unorganized sector?
I mean, in my mind, I've never met a small company that doesn't want to be a big company, as an entrepreneur. I mean, I can idealize MSMEs, but when I was a small company, I wanted to be a big company someday. I'm not saying that's for everybody, but I think the biggest gift to the unorganized sector could be lower regulatory cholesterol. I'm not sure the unorganized sector, it's at least I have discovered it's the same hassle to manage a 5 crore company, a 500 crore company, and a 5,000 crore company. Some people who manage 5 crore companies work much harder than I do because they don't have people to order around and they don't have the money I have in the bank. So I think that this idealization of small is a little misplaced. I think we need a good continuum, but the notion that there are some people who want to stay informal, who want to stay small, and who want to be single person enterprises, and we should somehow leave them where they are but give them more resources, at least is not my view of the world. I think that's a static equilibrium view of the world. My view of the world is, the infrastructure of opportunity obviously involves more capital to all enterprises who deserve it and need it. But I think the biggest saboteur of infrastructure of opportunity in India is the regulatory cholesterol. I think it is, I have 150 guys in regulatory affairs whose full-time job is handling the regulatory cholesterol. I don't think small companies will be able to afford that. And so I think that if we really want to give Purna Swaraj to the MSMEs of India, Purna Swaraj from the regulatory cholesterol is probably a better gift than just handing them money. Because once you give them Purna Swaraj, the more talented entrepreneurs, the courage on your back, in your heart, the strength of your back and the sweat on your brow should matter more than your connections, right? And that only happens when you reduce the regulatory cholesterol. So I think, yes, obviously, MSME lending is a challenge, but MSME lending has been stuck at between 10 and 14 lakh crores for 10 years, despite multiple attempts to raise it. So I think that the problems may lie outside MSMEs, which is, why are the incentives to stay small high? Why are the incentives to stay informal high? Because many Indian entrepreneurs conclude that the benefits of informality are higher than the costs of informality. I think that's a toxic conclusion. I think it's starting to change with GST and many things where people are concluding that the benefits of formality now outweigh the costs of formality. And that's what gives me hope. So I think if we reduce the costs of formality, that would be the biggest gift to the informal sector.
Thank you. Anyone else with questions?
Sir, just a follow-up to the question.
Yeah, sure. Dhawan, go ahead.
So then what are the indicators for the informal or the formality of the sector? So you mentioned that the benefits and the cost of staying informal, the benefits of staying informal is much more than the cost of staying informal. So what are the benefits then, the other benefits other than just the cash or the capital dividend?
Well, it's productivity. What is the difference between a baby and a dwarf? A baby and a dwarf are both small. The difference is not more food. It is not more money, right? The difference between a baby and a dwarf is in DNA. And so I think the benefits of formality are access to credit, but most importantly, are access to talent. I think that the informal sector always, if you think the formal sector has high turnover, I mean, try the informal sector. I mean, as soon as anybody in the informal sector gets a job in the formal sector, he leaves, right? Either because of signaling value of the formal sector or because of the wage premium in the formal sector, because of the higher productivity. So I think overall informality was a warlike emergency kind of solution, but you can't stay in that forever. So I would submit that the benefits of formality are at the individual level, they are at the company level, and they are at the country level. So I think we can't jump overnight, but I think things like GST, which was a reverse Brexit in some sense, right? I mean, we took 24 different markets and made it one, while Brexit is moving in the other direction. And I think, like Brexit, obviously IBC, UPI, there are many elements that will go into formalization. I think the difference between Haath wali salary and Chitti wali salary, Provident Fund plus ESI plus EDLI is almost 42%. Now, whenever I hire somebody and I tell him 25,000 rupee salary to a fresher, he says, Haath wali salary, sir, or Chitti wali salary? So I think I don't think any country in the world has a 45% difference between gross and net wages. So those are also changes which need to happen. I think they will all happen. They are all being considered in the pipeline.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. More questions? Okay, Varda.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the session. It was very insightful. And one thing, in continuation with what you said, that the regulatory cholesterol are related to what formality and informality would bring. You also gave example of other countries who have done similar, but then I was reading about a book or some patterns that USA and China had followed, where there are examples where the bureaucrats who were later allowed into business, going into business, or those bureaucrats who later transferred to the other private sectors, as you said, that when they get incentives, that has actually helped them in bringing reforms, because they then know how things has to be. They know the both of the sides. But in India, it's often frowned upon when there is corporate and bureaucrats are together, or on the political side as well. But in terms of if there are appointments, then it's vested interest or something is thought upon. So what are your thoughts on coordination or more interaction between the regulatory side and the corporate or the business world, and how that can be done in productive or positive way?
I mean, Paracelsus, he was a Renaissance physician. He used to say the dose makes the poison, right? Anything powerful enough to help has the power to hurt. So if you allow regulatory capture by business, which some people say has happened in some parts of the world, that is wrong. But if you believe that you can run an economy without business, that is also wrong, right? Which is really what the 1955 Avadi resolution essentially decided, right? The 1955 Avadi resolution, I mean, the government bought Air India for 2.5 crores, but it spent 1.1 lakh crore in the last 10 years, right? And even now it's not able to, it loses 20 crores a day, at least this month. So my sense is, I don't think we need to view this as business versus government versus civil society. If the lack of government made places hotbeds of entrepreneurial activity, then Kabul would be a hotbed of venture capital, or Waziristan, Swat Valley in Pakistan would be hotbeds of venture capital. I don't at any time make the case that a vibrant economy needs a weak government. It needs an appropriate government. It needs an effective government. Only a government can provide public goods, and public goods are a very important part of private sector success. So I think that we need a much more fluid system. I think some lateral entry might be useful for government. Do I think all civil servants should be lateral entry? I don't think so. But I think the notion that there are only 4,700 IAS officers in India, and the notion that somehow generalists of that kind, I think the world has changed. Some specialization is required. I think some generalists are required. Some lateral entry is required. Some people coming in at the beginning is required. So I think overall the system needs an overhaul, not just in how business and government interact with each other, but how we select, how we train, how we do the performance management, and how we structure the organizations which of civil service in this country. I mean, there are 800 CAG officers. I think 799 are ranked outstanding. I mean, that's mathematically impossible, no, for 99% of people to be outstanding. So I think that we have to do a better job of performance management in government. I think we should introduce the colonel threshold of the government. In the army, if you're not shortlisted for brigadier or major general, you retire at 50, 52, or 54. And I think that is good because a big problem in civil services is promotable but not postable. These people who nobody wants, but you keep promoting them, right? And so I think that this question which you framed as private versus public is much broader about the private sector doing what. There are lots of chores in the private sector. I was on the RBI board, and the 10 lakh crores of NPAs are embarrassing. Some of them are related to public sector banks, but obviously somebody in the private sector chose to topi penna the depositors, right? So I think that there's nobody here who is better than anybody else. I mean, the private sector has its incentives, civil servants have their incentives, and civil society has their incentives. And we just need to get better at swimming in our lanes, better at respecting what each other is good at, and just thinking about more openness on all sides. I mean, essentially, listening on the part of government to the private sector doesn't mean that you do what the private sector tells you, or for the private sector to recognize that IBC, which is the bankruptcy code, is a really important. Failure is a part. Socialism is basically capitalism without competition and bankruptcy. And I think competition and bankruptcy are a very important part of a healthy economy. So I wouldn't frame it as public versus private or government versus business. I would just frame it as a three-legged stool where the three stools of civil society, government, and private sector need to work together.
Thank you, Manish ji. Further questions do we have? Sushant, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, namaste, sir. My name is Sushant, and I'm a learner at Rashtram School of Public Leadership. You talked about signaling values, and there is one more concern that organized and unorganized sector, both of them face, is the employability of the new candidates entering into the market. So how do you look at both these phenomena in light of NEP? And how can we better at these things? Because as an emerging market and looking at the global scale and new companies entering India, how can that be achieved?
I mean, Michael Spence got his Nobel Prize for his work on the signaling value of higher education, right? I went to Wharton. Wharton's a good place to be at, but it's a better place to be from, right? The fundamental value of being from IIM or IIT is not being at IIM or IIT, it is being from IIM or IIT. But going to college isn't what it used to be, right? 60% of taxi drivers in Korea now have a college degree. 31% of retail checkout clerks in the US now have a college degree. 15% of high-end security guards in India now have a college degree. So college wasn't it used to be, but obviously college has signaling value, right? The degree, shadi kaise hogi, or employers being lazy. So I would just say that the economy is getting more sophisticated at signaling value, right? The first Nobel Prize for signaling value was really Peter Diamond of MIT maybe 20 years ago, who got his Nobel Prize for search costs in labor markets. But, a few years ago, Shapley and Ross got a very interesting Nobel Prize for thinking about matching markets and structure of matching markets, and where they made the case that equity markets clear on price, but labor markets clear on information. And so we have to get better. Why are we giving up on our employment exchanges? But there will always be a tension between quantity and quality, right? See, IITs and IIMs are tight entry gates and wide open exit gates. The chartered accountant exam has a wide open entry gate, but a tight exit gate. 95% of the people fail. Vocational training in India, unfortunately, had wide open entry gates and wide open exit gates. So therefore, they didn't have signaling value. But there was a wonderful book written in the 1960s by the Education Secretary of the US, John Gardner. He said, "Can we be equal and excellent?" And that's an interesting tension, right? In a democracy, you want everybody to be equal, but how will you be excellent if you have to have a school system of 200 million people? So I think signaling value in India is a complex concept. We need high quantity, we need high quality, and we need reasonable cost, right? But sometimes in education, quantity, quality, and cost can be contradictory objectives. There are very few institutions which give you all three. Most institutions give you 2 out of 3, some give you only 1 out of 3. And so you need to be careful with, from a policy perspective, I think NEP strikes the right balance between being equal and excellent.
Thank you, Manish, for that. While others raise their hand, there's a question that I have got on chat. Virender is asking if, can you tell us a bit about the vocational university that you're building, vocational training university, and why do you think about it?
Essentially, a vocational university is different from a normal university in 3 ways. One is we pray to one God, which is employers. Second is only 5% of our kids are on campus. The balance are either online, on the job, on site. So we have 5 classrooms. All 4 classrooms are equal. And only 5% are doing a degree, but 100% have the ability to take a 3-month certificate as an opening balance for a 1-year diploma, as an opening balance for a 3-year degree. The essential reason is that the problem is in signaling value, the problem is in financing, and the problem was in degrees. So we said, what is the life form which meets all these criteria? It is 1/3 employment exchange, 1/3 ITI, and 1/3 college. Now, employment exchanges don't know how to work with employers or colleges. Colleges don't know how to work with employers or ITIs, and ITIs don't know how to work with colleges and employers. So you needed somebody like us, Teamlease, who has 3 lakh employees on any day and only has 5% of the kids. We said we were in a unique position to be the clearinghouse, which could bridge the gap between employers and academia, but not be a research university. I'm not trying to be a research university. I define success as getting the kid a job. And so that's a little more that it's not an ITI on steroids, nor is it a university on a diet. It's just a different life form. That's how I think about it. And I think that everybody, when you have a notion that a university is like Oxford, Cambridge, or Harvard, maybe that's one kind of university. But I think that if you acknowledge that innovation comes from genetically diverse, statistically independent institutions and life forms, which is how I think of innovation, then a vocational university like ours is very different from Delhi University. But in some ways, it's very similar, right? Delhi University's budget this year is 800 crores. Actually, Teamlease's budget is 800 crores, a skill university. And only 3% of Delhi University's fees comes from students. Actually, only 3% of Teamlease's skills university's fees come from students. But they get 97% from the government, and I get 97% from employers. And I was told that, employers would never cough up this kind of amounts, but we've proven the model. And I think with a little regulatory cholesterol removed, we still have a challenge with degree apprenticeships. We still have a challenge with online education. There's still some regulatory cholesterol left. But I think once that goes away, we think that we will be India's largest private university by number of students, obviously not by revenues or anything else.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yeah, Prakash ji, please. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Excellent session. I really enjoyed it. I had one question. You said, like, why is our country poor? Where in America, they're so rich, and so there is a statistic I read that in the 17th century, as early as in the 17th century, our GDP was about 25% of the world. And today we are less than 1% of the world. So would you think that probably there is something in our hoary past, which so has been so much of excellence and all that, maybe we should, look into that hoary past and find out something that can be applied here now. Thank you.
Lisa, in the 17th century, your GDP was purely linked to your population. The divergence of per capita income only started in 1820 after the Industrial Revolution. Before 1800, per capita incomes were almost the same as 500 AD. So from 500 AD to about 1700 AD, per capita incomes almost of the world stayed stagnant. After 1800 is when per capita income started diverging substantially. And I think that was the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, us being a colonial power, Dadabhai Naoroji's drain theory, I mean, he was India's first data scientist. He used the British data set to prove that the British were screwing us. So I think to my mind, yes, of course, there's a lot of, you don't have to be Western to be modern. There is a lot in our past that we can learn from. But I think, fundamentally, a modern economy is a knowledge economy. I think India, because of our past, I do think that there are elements of our culture which value education. If you think of many parts of our past, they laid down some of the nuggets of the knowledge economy that we have. But, we are where we are. So path dependence is a given in history, right? Where we are where we are because of where we're coming from. There is something in our past that we can reevaluate. I don't think we have to be Western to be modern, but we must acknowledge that some of our poverty is our creation. I mean, I think after independence, being so ideological about the private sector was probably not the right thing. I'm not saying we should. I don't think everybody in the private sector is honest or wants to build a great company, but obviously not everybody in the private sector is a chore, right? I mean, that's also true, right? It's like every bureaucrat is not corrupt. And so I think the ideological slants that came in the last 75 years, where when Ashoka Hotel was being built in Delhi in Chanakyapuri, the first time parliamentarian Atal Bihari Vajpayee asked Nehru that, why are you building a 5-star hotel and not a hospital? And obviously, the ideological response of private sector capacity could not be said, because Jamshedji Tata had built Taj Hotel in Bombay in 1903, and it was one of the world's best hotels. So Jawaharlal Nehru said, well, we will use the profits of this luxury hotel to build a hospital. Now, Ashoka Hotel has never made profits, and you couldn't build a hospital from that money. In fact, Ashoka Hotel had to be bailed out many times. So I think if you're implying that there is something in our past that we should look to, absolutely. I mean, I think our identity and we lost some of our bearings in some ways, but in some ways, it was friendly fire. We also didn't do everything right that we could have after independence. We did many things right. I mean, I think it's a remarkable story of a poor, diverse, large country like ours emerging as a democracy. But economically, some of our choices were crappy, and those choices are being changed. So now I'm quite actually hopeful about the next 25 years really being India's time. I think that there's an external forces moving in our favor. There's an internal realization of our challenges. We haven't solved all our problems yet, but we're well on our way to recognizing our problems. And the first stage in solving a problem is recognizing them.
Thank you, Manish ji. Since we are now running out of time and we had asked his time for an hour, we should respect that. Thank you, Manish ji, for a very, very invigorating session. I think a lot of things that you have said, we'll have to actually go back and listen to it again to absorb the import of what you have said. And I think, I mean, this has been said before, but we all come from our respective backgrounds and have our own ideological positions. I think Manish ji has challenged them and has laid down his case for that. And that is formalization, urbanization, industrialization, financialization, and the human capital. If we could think about this, I think it would be a good food for thought. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We'll connect once again. Thank you, Ji. Namaste.
Thank you. Good luck. Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you all. Be sure to fill the feedback form for this by 8 p.m. tomorrow. And I look forward to seeing you at the Master Degree on the 15th and the Congress Ceremony on the 16th. Thank you very much for joining us today. Have a good evening. Good night.